When 7-year-old Dennis Martin and his family arrived in the Spencefield area of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on June 14, 1969, they planned to enjoy their annual Father's Day vacation hiking in the mountains. Instead, Dennis became the victim of one of the most mysterious national park disappearances in history. Dennis Lloyd Martin, a 7-year-old special needs child from Knoxville, Tennessee, disappeared near the Spencefield area of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on June 14, 1969. Despite law enforcement conducting the largest search inside a national park, Dennis was never found. Even 53 years later, no one knows where the boy went that day, but that hasn't stopped the conspiracy theories from running rampant. So how did Dennis Martin disappear? Dennis, his father, grandfather, and older brother, who was 9 years old at the time, reached Spencefield on Saturday, June 14th, 1969, after spending the previous night at the Russell Field Shelter, which was 2 miles to the west of Spencefield. Dennis was a special needs child, and while his natural age was 7, his mental age lagged about a half year behind. According to his father, Dennis was quiet, he never threw fits, but did have a tendency to talk to strangers. On the day he disappeared, he was wearing a red t-shirt, green pants, and Oxford shoes. The family planned to camp in the shelter at Spencefield before moving on down the Appalachian Trail the next day. In the late afternoon of June 14th, the adults were hanging out watching Dennis and the other boys play southwest of the Anthony Creek trailhead. The boys had the idea that they would try to sneak up on the adults and scare them. The plan was for Douglas, Dennis's older brother, and 2 other boys to go south and then west to approach the adults, while Dennis went the opposite direction, which was northwest, to sneak up on them from another angle. When the boys split up to carry out their surprise plan, that was the last time Dennis Martin was seen. This was around 4:30 p.m. The adults had noticed the boys splitting up on the Tennessee side of Spencefield. This was potentially important because along the middle of the field was the boundary between Tennessee and North Carolina. A few minutes after the boys split up, Dennis's father started worrying, and he called out for Dennis. With no response, he headed off west on the Appalachian Trail to Little Bald, which was about a mile hike, before turning back to hopefully find Dennis with the group. After not seeing Dennis back with the others, Mr. Martin walked west again, this time 2.5 miles along the Appalachian Trail back to Russell Field. Still unable to find Dennis, he returned and laid out his concerns to Dennis's grandfather, who then traveled down Anthony Creek Trail to Cades Cove to alert the rangers of Dennis's disappearance. Dennis's grandfather, Clyde Martin, reached the rangers at 8:30 p.m., already 4 hours after Dennis was last seen. A passing couple in Spencefield transported Mr. Martin to the junction of Boat Mountain Road and Laurel Creek Road so he could continue searching on that Saturday night. The couple had not seen anything unusual during their day in the park, they claimed. Once alerted, Ranger Huffman headed to Spencefield while Ranger Nielsen picked up Mr. Martin and they drove up Boat Mountain Road back to Spencefield. Mr. Martin and the Rangers spoke to a group of hikers from Derrick Knob, some fishermen from Hazel Creek, and hikers who had just come from Fontana Dam. None of them had seen the missing boy. The park headquarters dispatcher was notified at 8:28 p.m. that Dennis Martin was missing. Once Chief Ranger Snedden had been informed of the situation, rangers and family members back at Spencefield continued searching for Dennis that night. Unfortunately, heavy rain would move in with the sunset on Saturday, severely hampering the search by putting down almost 3 inches of rain at Spence Field. In spite of the rain, the search continued around Spence Field for the rest of the night. At 5 a.m. the next morning, Sunday, June 15th, park rangers assembled a group that included the Blount and Sevier County Rescue Squads, the Smoky Mountain Hiking Club, and certain civilians that were able to assist in the search. One team began what rangers call a drainage search down the west prong of the Little River, Anthony Creek, Little Bald, and Spence Field. Ranger Phillips hiked up the Eagle Creek Trail to Spence Field, which happened to be the only nearby trail that went unsearched during the night before. 30 Boy Scouts walked west on the Appalachian Trail towards Spence Field, while 8 Boy Scouts walked down the Jenkins Ridge Trail. They found nothing. Ranger Nichols then thought to contact 51 Ranger students who happened to be on a field trip in Franklin, North Carolina, to come to support the search effort. At noon, Mrs. Martin arrived in Cades Cove. Shortly after, 2 helicopters were in the air, and a nearby U.S. Special Forces unit was sending 40 Special Forces to the area. The next day, Monday, June 16th, the search continued as even more manpower was brought into the area to help. As the days went on, locations were checked and double-checked. Searchers had even reached the edge of Fontana Lake, where they began searching the shoreline there. Rain and fog rolled through the area, making the search more difficult than it could have been. Regardless, more special forces arrived in the park to help, rising the total number of troops to 62. If anyone could find the boy, surely it would be the Special Forces unit. On Tuesday, June 17th, a pair of hikers found a faint set of small tracks in the Eagle Creek area of the park, a mile below Spence Field. The footprint trail lasted for 300 yards before the hikers lost it at the edge of a stream. What was strange about the pair of tracks was that one foot looked to be barefoot and the other looked to be from an Oxford shoe, which was what Dennis was wearing. Rangers cast the footprints, but the Martin family didn't believe they were Dennis's, so everyone sort of just moved on. On Wednesday, June 18th, the first prediction was called in. The next day, Thursday, another prediction had been telephoned in. This prediction led Rangers to concentrate Special Forces efforts between Forester Ridge and Jenkins Trail Ridge below Haw Gap. A natural question to ask is, why are they following the ramblings of civilians that could be hundreds of miles away? Well, frankly, neither the searchers nor the Special Forces had come up with one bit of definitive evidence, and with public pressure mounting, officials thought they had to follow the only leads they had. TVA also joined the search by sending their best woodsmen to the park. By Friday and Saturday of the next weekend, the Chief Ranger had called a meeting. This meeting would serve the purpose of laying out an official strategy for finding Dennis, either dead or alive. As week 2 of the search started, the search had covered almost 57 square miles in a single week. This was the extreme edge of the logical search pattern. No one had any clue where Dennis could be, so they set out again to recheck every square mile they had been over so far. During that second week of searching, searchers continued going back over every inch of the 57 square miles they had already been through. Every day the search party dwindled, as people had to get back to work, and a sense of normality was ready to creep back into the park. On Sunday, June 29th, a short morning search on the Tennessee side of Spence Field resulted in no new information. Dennis had simply disappeared, without a trace or a piece of real evidence. At 5 p.m., a meeting between law enforcement and the Martin family was held. These were the points that were discussed. Number 1, there's no evidence to support a kidnapping. The FBI cannot launch a full-scale investigation, but the investigation can continue as is. Number 2, it is up to the family if they want to offer a reward. Number 3, The chief ranger assured the Martins that they were prepared to continue the search for another 90 days with 3 men. Number 4. Mr. Martin felt that it was all over in the 5 minutes before he started searching for Dennis. And number 5. Mr. Martin believes people have the ability to see or predict things. At 6 p.m., the operation at Spence Field was closed down. Rangers secured the area and brought the last piece of equipment down the trail. The largest search inside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park had officially ended with no good leads to Dennis Martin's location. It would be up to the 3 searchers the park was willing to have continue on if they were to find Dennis or any clues about where he went. During the search, 1,400 searchers were used, including up to 71 special forces. Over 13,000 man-hours were used. The search cost over $50,000. 57 rescue squads from as many counties participated in the search. 10 newspapers, 10 radio stations, and 6 TV stations were all involved. So previously we mentioned predictions during the search. Well, what exactly are these predictions from civilians? As can be the case in any tragic event, civilians are bound to call in with tips on where to search next. While these tips are virtually always wrong, officials were so desperate that they followed up on each one. From Gene Dixon in Washington, D.C. Quote, "Look around the area where the boy was last seen playing. He went out on level ground, went down an incline, and turned off to a loft at 40 to 50 degree angle and up a little. Then went back down and would be underneath the point of incline. The area where he turned left has shrubbery and is thickety. Did not see any trees where he cleared off to the left. More or less bare ground." This one from Harold Sherman of Louisiana. Quote, "He will be found 2 miles to the left of where he was last seen by his father or brother. Fell off a steep place. Hung up in the bushes." From Jeffrey Owens of Gatlinburg. Quote, "Had dreams the last 2 nights about the lost boy. In dreams, he is not very far from where he was lost. The night before, I last saw him lying on a hill behind a log. But last night, dreamed he had dragged himself down to the river for water." These are just a few of the predictions that came in, and believe it or not, the Martin family was very receptive to them. On top of the predictions that people were making about the location of Dennis Martin, civilians also sent in advice to the officials who were searching on the ground. One of these came from a lady who said to start looking in trees and treetops and stop looking on the ground. A telegram received on June 22nd from Glenn Chandler in Mascot, Tennessee said to, quote, "Take several friendly dogs, including the boy's own, put package containing food and plastic raincoat around their necks. Release dogs 1 to 2 miles apart. Be sure dogs are lost the same as Dennis. By chance one may find his trail and follow him for friendship. Dogs could be released by helicopter. Thank you." From an unknown caller, quote, "2 branches go through Spence Field and come together. There is a hole. You have to step in it to know it is there. Fern growing out of it." From Betty Phillips of Townsend, Tennessee, quote, "A boy was seen by himself at Elkmont by a waterfall by Joe Jones, who lives in a trailer. The first trailer on the left marked private at Walland. Turn right at King's Grocery and cross the bridge to the trailer. Can check this by calling Joe McKee, a Walland preacher." Despite the ridiculousness of these suggestions, every single one was checked and rechecked. Of course, there were no positive leads. So there were a lot of suspicions around the disappearance of Dennis Martin, especially coming from the Martin family. The Martin family had suspicions concerning several people who were around the area that day or came thereafter, especially during the later parts of the search. Number 1 was Richard French from Dandridge, who was a contractor. Mrs. Martin felt that Mr. French could have possibly taken Dennis for unknown reasons. Billy Nolan, a psychic from New Orleans, came to help the search here without any funds or equipment, wanted permission to stay in the area after the search for several days, was sure he could find the boy. The Martin family was very suspicious of Billy Nolan's intentions. And then there was Carter Martin. Another Martin family camped in Spence Field. The Martin family wondered if someone could have gotten the two Martin families mixed up and kidnapped the wrong boy. The FBI had no actual evidence to go further with a large investigation, and the fact that the family had any interest in some of these clearly false reports mean that they would not accept the possibility that Dennis ever goes undiscovered. Mr. Martin continued to stay in contact with rangers, however. In January of the next year, he requested the names for all campfire permits during the disappearance, the register that hikers signed, and permits for extended camping weekends. So even after the main search had been dissolved, there were instances that could have opened up new leads into the disappearance of Dennis Martin. On July 3rd, a few days after the main force of searchers left, Ranger Dwight McCarter and a few others were retracing their steps through various areas that had been previously searched. As they walked the West Prong Trail on their way to Spence Field, Ranger McCarter reported a stench as the wind blew. He knew that this smell wasn't just a dead animal. It was different. When park officials radioed back, they said it was a dead crow, that they had checked the area already, and it was time for them to move on. Ranger McCarter, to this day, believes they should have investigated the smell, as it was close to the child's tracks they found during the search. Of course, McCarter admits that he couldn't be sure that it was Dennis's body he smelt, but he thought they should have at least investigated it at the time. About a month after Dennis disappeared, an interesting new lead turned the case upside down. A Middle Tennessee man named Harold Key told park officials he had some information on the Dennis Martin case. He said that he was visiting Cades Cove the same weekend as the Martin family. He was hiking through the woods with hopes of finding a bear. He believed this hike landed him around Spence Field about 6 or 7 p.m. in the evening. This was about an hour and a half after Dennis had disappeared. Key went on to explain that he heard a loud scream as he headed back to his car. He couldn't say in which direction the scream came from, but indicated it was a terrifying and sickening scream. Then, he heard movement in the woods next to him a few minutes later. That's when he spotted a man hiding in the bushes. Key said the man in question was hurrying towards the parking lot, trying to avoid being seen. Key ended up crossing the creek and found what looked to be a badly drawn map on a piece of paper that the man had dropped. When Key arrived back at his car, he noticed the white older model Chevrolet that had been in the parking lot was now gone. Rangers went to work plotting out the location Key would have been at. They determined it to be at Sea Branch, which was a small stream that crosses the south leg of Cades Cove Loop Road west of Rowan's Creek. That puts Harold Key 5 miles from Spence Field as the crow flies. If trails were included as the only means of travel, then it would have extended to a distance of almost 9 miles away. It was virtually impossible for a human being to cover that distance in 2 hours or less. Maybe an Olympic athlete could do it, but that's it. The peculiar bit about Harold Key's story lies in why he kept it from officials for so long. But Key stuck to his story all the way to his death, which was at age 94. Park officials, to this day, claim Harold Key's experience had nothing to do with Dennis Martin's disappearance. In July of 1985, a man contacted Ranger McCarter and told him about the day that he found what he thought was child's remains near Tremont. The man, however, had found this skeleton years ago and never reported it because he didn't want to be caught for illegally hunting ginseng. 30 men searched the area the man described and found nothing. So what happened to Dennis Martin that day? Where did he go? Did somebody take him? Over 53 years later, nothing has ever been found leading to Dennis Martin. So what happened? Well, there are three prevailing theories. The first is that Dennis became lost on his own and died from exposure or hypothermia, likely during the first night. The second is that Dennis was attacked by a bear and carried off. The third is Dennis was kidnapped and taken out of the park by something or someone. Park officials believe theory number one, that he most likely died from exposure after being lost. This theory is plausible because there have been other instances of people getting lost in the park and never being found again. Dennis's father believed that Dennis was kidnapped, but we know that Mr. Martin and the family were looking for an explanation that would indicate Dennis could still be alive. The real question is, what do you think happened? The Dennis Martin case, by today's standards, was poorly run. Mistakes were made across the board. Having the largest search force in park history is actually a negative, evidence has come to prove. Instead of having a bunch of inexperienced searchers rushing out to find a missing person, it's better to have a small team of professionals who will take their time and carefully examine the area as they widen their search. Having such a large force can also lead to contamination in most of the areas around the search, and it can even destroy potential clues without anyone knowing it. Another big issue I have with the search is the blindness with which those in control of the investigation dismiss potential clues, such as the tracks found in the woods or the stench of the body that Ranger McCarter found. Those were all huge mistakes to just shuffle them off and not investigate them. Rescue teams across the world still use the Dennis Martin disappearance in their training. The National Park Service completely changed its search and rescue procedures in 1969 after the disappearance of Dennis, and those changes have led to the safe return of many lives. By turning search and rescue into more of a science, it has evolved to help many people around the world. Maybe one day we will find out what happened to Dennis Martin, but until then, his mysterious disappearance will continue to haunt the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. If you liked today's video, please like and subscribe, as it lets me know that you want more of the content I produce.